The mechanical chimney brush was invented in 1803. That is not a rough estimate. It is not an approximation. A man named Joseph Glass, a Bristol engineer, designed, built, and demonstrated a series of cane rods with bristle heads that could be threaded up through a chimney from the fireplace below. The rods were flexible. The bristles were stiff. The operator stood on the ground floor, fed the rods upward, section by section, and scraped the creosote from the flue walls without any person ever entering the chimney itself. It worked. Blackwell has read the demonstration reports. The brush cleaned chimneys of every standard residential diameter in England. It handled bends. It handled height. It handled the thick tar deposits that accumulated over winter months. The device was not a theory. It was not a prototype awaiting further development. It was a finished, functional, commercially available tool. In 1803, England continued to send small children up chimneys until 1875. 72 years. That is not a gap between invention and adoption. That is a lifetime. A child born the year the brush was invented could have grown old and died before England stopped pushing boys into flues. And many did exactly that. They were born, they were pushed, they died, while the machine that could have replaced them gathered dust in a Bristol workshop. This is not a story about technology. The technology was solved. This is not a story about ignorance. Parliament was informed. This is not a story about the cruelty of a distant age. Other reforms passed. Other injustices were corrected. The abolition of slavery moved through Parliament in 1833. Factory Acts limiting child labour began in 1833. The Mines Act of 1842 banned children under 10 from working underground. But the climbing boys kept climbing. For 72 years, the answer was on the shelf, and nobody reached for it. Blackwell spent 6 months in the parliamentary archives, the Foundling Hospital records, the vestry minutes of London parishes, and the correspondence of the men who tried to stop this. What follows is not a story about Victorian cruelty. It is a story about arithmetic, and the arithmetic will make you sick. To understand why a 7-year-old boy was worth less than a bundle of cane rods, Blackwell needs to take you back to a fireplace. Not in 1803, earlier, much earlier. The English chimney is a peculiar thing. Unlike the wide, straight chimneys of continental Europe, the English chimney evolved as a narrow, winding passage. There are architectural reasons for this. English houses, particularly in London, were built tall and narrow. Land was expensive. Houses were squeezed together in terraces. The chimneys had to navigate around rooms, around structural beams, around neighbouring chimneys. They twisted, they turned, they tapered. A chimney flue in a Georgian townhouse might be 9 inches wide at its narrowest point. 9 inches. The width of a dinner plate. And they had to be cleaned. This was not optional. A chimney clogged with creosote was a chimney waiting to catch fire. And a chimney fire in a London terrace meant a street on fire. The Great Fire of 1666 burned for 4 days and destroyed 13,000 houses. London did not forget. Clean your chimneys. That was not a suggestion. It was survival. So who cleaned them? The answer, for roughly 300 years, was children. Small children. The smaller the better. A master sweep would acquire a boy, usually between the ages of 4 and 10, and send him up the chimney with a scraping brush and a cap to keep the soot from his eyes. The boy would climb using his knees and elbows, pressing his body against the flue walls, inching upward through the dark. At the top, he would scrape. Then he would come back down. The word acquire is precise. Blackwell chose it deliberately. These children were not hired, they were obtained. The primary source of climbing boys was the parish workhouse. Under the poor law system, orphans and abandoned children were wards of the parish, and the parish could apprentice them to any trade. A master sweep would approach a workhouse, sign an indenture, and walk out with a child. The parish paid the sweep to take the boy, not the other way around. The parish paid the sweep. Taking a child off the parish rolls saved the ratepayers money. The sweep received a fee and a free labourer. The child received nothing except a new address and a flue. Some children were sold directly by their parents. Blackwell found records from the early 1800s of children sold to sweeps for as little as 3 shillings and sixpence. Some were sold for a few pints of beer. Some were simply given away, the parents too poor or too overwhelmed or too indifferent to object. By the late 1700s, there were an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 climbing boys in England. In London alone, master sweeps employed several hundred children at any given time. The youngest were 4 years old. The average working age was 6 to 8. By the time a boy reached 12 or 13, he was usually too large to fit in the flues, at which point he was turned out. No skills, no education, no prospects. If he survived to 13, many did not. The chimneys were dark. The soot was thick. The flues were narrow enough that a child's body would become wedged if he turned wrong. There are coroner's reports from the 1700s and 1800s describing boys found suffocated in chimney bends, their knees drawn up against their chests, their fingernails broken from clawing at the brick. Some boys were found days after they became stuck, their masters having simply moved on to the next job and the next boy. The fires were worse. Homeowners were instructed to let the fire die before the sweep arrived, but compliance was inconsistent. Boys were sent into chimneys that were still warm. Sometimes they were sent into chimneys that were still lit. The creosote in the flue would ignite around them. There are records of boys pulled from chimneys with their skin hanging off in sheets. There are records of boys who were not pulled out at all. And then there was the cancer. Sir Percival Pott, a surgeon at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, published a paper in 1775 identifying what he called chimney sweep's cancer. It was a cancer of the scrotum caused by prolonged exposure to soot. The soot worked into the skin, particularly the skin of the groin, where it accumulated in the folds and creases of a boy's body. The cancer appeared in young men, often in their late teens or early 20s. Pott described it as a malignant ulceration that began as a superficial sore and rapidly invaded deeper tissues. The survival rate was effectively 0. Pott's paper was the first identified occupational cancer in medical history. It was published in 1775, 28 years before the mechanical brush was invented, 50 years before the first parliamentary attempt to regulate the trade, 100 years before the practice actually stopped. The medical profession knew, the surgical profession knew, the cancer was named, the cause was identified, the population at risk was defined. Nobody stopped. Now here is where the story becomes something other than a simple tale of historical cruelty, because the response to this knowledge was not silence, it was noise, considerable noise. Well-intentioned, articulate, politically organized noise. And it changed nothing. For 7 decades, it changed nothing. That is the mystery Blackwell wants you to hold in your mind. Not why did this happen, but why did it keep happening after everyone agreed it should stop? The first organized effort came from a man named Jonas Hanway. Hanway was a philanthropist, a reformer, and by all accounts a deeply irritating person. He was the first man in London to carry an umbrella, which gives you some sense of his willingness to endure public ridicule for a cause he believed in. In the 1770s, Hanway began campaigning for the regulation of chimney sweeps. He published pamphlets. He lobbied members of Parliament. He described the conditions in language that left nothing to the imagination. Hanway died in 1786 without seeing a single piece of legislation passed. The next effort came from David Porter, a master sweep who had climbed chimneys himself as a boy and who understood the trade from inside. Porter was unusual. Most master sweeps defended the practice. Porter did not. He argued publicly that mechanical devices could replace climbing boys entirely. He demonstrated the machines. He invited members of Parliament to watch. They watched. They were impressed. They did nothing. In 1788, the Chimney Sweepers Act was passed. Blackwell found the text. It prohibited the apprenticing of any child under the age of 8. It required that apprentices be washed once a week. It required that they not be sent up chimneys that were actually on fire. The penalties for violation were negligible. Enforcement was non-existent. The act was, by every practical measure, decorative. A law that existed on paper and nowhere else. In 1803, Joseph Glass invented the mechanical brush. In 1804, the Society for Superseding the Necessity of Climbing Boys was founded. The name alone tells you everything about the era. It was a formal organization with members, meetings and subscriptions dedicated to promoting the mechanical brush as an alternative to child labor in chimneys. They held demonstrations. They published reports. They documented the brush's effectiveness in chimney after chimney, house after house. They proved, repeatedly and publicly, that a mechanical device operated by an adult could clean a chimney as thoroughly as a small child, in less time, with no risk of injury, suffocation, or cancer. The reports were filed. The demonstrations were attended. The brush was available for purchase. The climbing boys kept climbing. In 1817, a bill was introduced in Parliament to ban the use of climbing boys entirely. The sponsor was Henry Grey Bennet, a member of Parliament who had taken up the cause with genuine passion. Bennet presented evidence. He presented testimony. He presented the medical literature. He presented the mechanical brush. The bill passed the House of Commons. The House of Lords killed it. The Lords argued that the mechanical brush could not adequately clean chimneys with bends and angles. This was false. The brush had been demonstrated in exactly such chimneys. But the claim was made, and it was enough. Blackwell tracked down the Lords who opposed the bill. Many of them owned large estates with extensive chimney systems. Many of them employed master sweeps directly. The connection was not subtle. In 1834, a new Chimney Sweepers Act was passed. This one raised the minimum age to 14 and increased penalties for violations. The penalty for employing a child under 14, a fine of up to £10. For context, a master sweep earned between £50 and £100 per year. A single fine could wipe out a significant portion of annual income. But the fines were almost never levied. Blackwell searched the magistrates' records for London between 1834 and 1840. The number of prosecutions under the 1834 Act in that 6-year period was 4. 4 prosecutions in 6 years in a city with hundreds of active sweeps employing hundreds of children. 4. Why? Because prosecution required a complainant. Someone had to report the violation. Someone had to appear before a magistrate. Someone had to give testimony. The children could not testify against their masters. The parents who had sold them were not going to appear. The parish officials who had signed the indentures were not going to incriminate themselves. The homeowners who hired the sweeps did not see what happened inside the chimney. And the master sweeps operated in the early morning hours, before dawn, when the streets were empty and the witnesses were sleeping. The law existed, the enforcement did not. The distance between the two was measured in children's bodies. In 1840, another act. This one made it illegal for anyone under 21 to climb a chimney. The penalty was raised, the language was stronger, the intent was clear. The practice continued. Blackwell found a report from the Children's Employment Commission of 1863, 23 years after the 1840 Act theoretically ended the practice. The report documented that climbing boys were still being used in significant numbers across England. The Commission interviewed children. It documented their injuries. It photographed their deformities. It presented its findings to Parliament. Parliament received the report. Parliament did not act. There is a pattern here that Blackwell wants you to see. It is not a pattern of ignorance. It is not a pattern of indifference. It is something more specific and more damaging. It is a pattern of acknowledgement without action. The knowledge was perfect. The technology was available. The moral consensus was real. Everyone agreed climbing boys should stop. And then everyone went home, and the boys kept climbing. The question is not, why were people cruel? People were not uniformly cruel. Many fought hard. Many spent their lives on this cause. The question is, why did the system resist a solution that everyone acknowledged was correct, available, and necessary? And the answer is arithmetic. Blackwell found the numbers. A mechanical brush cost between £1 and £3 to purchase. The maintenance was minimal. Replacement bristles, new cane sections. An adult operator could clean 8 to 12 chimneys per day, working alone. A climbing boy cost nothing to acquire, less than nothing. The parish paid the master sweep to take him. The boy required food, but the food provided was minimal. Many sweeps fed their boys on scraps. The boy required housing, but housing meant a cellar floor or an attic corner. The boy required no wages. He was an apprentice. Under the indenture system, the master owed the boy nothing except instruction in the trade, which in practice meant instruction in how to climb. The operational cost of a climbing boy was approximately zero. The operational cost of a mechanical brush was not zero. It was small, but it was not zero. And that was the entire calculation. Not cruelty, arithmetic. When one option costs nothing and the other option costs something, the system will choose nothing, every time. Regardless of what Parliament says, regardless of what the medical journals document, regardless of what the reformers demonstrate, the system optimizes for cost, and the cost of a child was zero. But there is more to the arithmetic than the cost of the brush. There is the cost of the transition. A master sweep who switched to mechanical brushes needed to learn a new skill. He needed to purchase equipment. He needed to work differently. He needed to change. Change has friction. Friction has cost. And the master sweep was not a wealthy man. He operated at the margins. His income depended on volume, as many chimneys as possible, as fast as possible, as cheaply as possible. The climbing boy was the cheapest possible unit of labor. Replacing him with a machine required capital expenditure. Small capital, but capital. And the master sweeps organized. This is a detail that Blackwell found buried in the parliamentary testimony, and it reframes the entire story. The master sweeps of London formed a loose trade association. They petitioned against the reform bills. They testified before parliamentary committees. They argued, consistently and successfully, that mechanical brushes were inadequate for English chimneys, that climbing boys were not mistreated, that the system worked, and that reform was unnecessary. Their testimony was false. The mechanical brush had been demonstrated to work in every type of chimney. The climbing boys were demonstrably mistreated. The system killed children, and reform was not only necessary but overdue. But the sweeps had something that the reformers did not: proximity to power. The sweeps served the houses of the wealthy. They entered through the servants' entrance at dawn. They cleaned the chimneys of the men who sat in the House of Lords. They were, in a functional sense, part of the household infrastructure of the ruling class, and the ruling class did not want its chimneys cleaned more slowly, or less thoroughly, or at greater cost. Blackwell is going to say that again because it matters. The men who voted down the reform bills in the House of Lords were the men whose chimneys were cleaned by climbing boys. They voted to continue a practice that killed children because the alternative might have cost them an extra shilling per chimney per quarter. Now here is where the obvious explanation fails, and Blackwell wants you to listen carefully, because this is the mechanism that makes the story important beyond its historical specifics. The obvious explanation is, people were cruel in the past. The Victorians were callous. They did not value children's lives. This is the explanation that lets you close the book and move on. It is also wrong. The same Parliament that refused to ban climbing boys abolished slavery in 1833. The same decade saw the Factory Act of 1833, which limited children's working hours in textile mills and appointed inspectors to enforce the limits. The Mines Act of 1842 banned boys under 10 and all females from working underground. The 10 Hours Act of 1847 limited the working day for women and young persons in factories. These reforms passed. They were enforced. They had teeth. The argument that, quote, zero falls apart against this evidence. People cared. Parliament acted. Inspectors were appointed. Fines were levied. The system moved. Except for the chimney sweeps. The chimney sweeps were the exception, and the exception reveals the rule. The textile mills employed thousands of children. The mines employed thousands. The scale was vast. The visibility was high. A factory was a building. An inspector could walk through the door, count the children, check the clock, and issue a citation. Enforcement was physically possible. A chimney was a hole in a wall. The work happened before dawn. The workplace was invisible. The workers were silent. An inspector could not climb into a chimney to verify whether a child was inside it. The physical structure of the work made enforcement nearly impossible. And the employers were not factory owners. They were not mine operators. They were individual tradesmen scattered across every city and town in England, operating independently, answering to no one. There was no factory gate to stand outside of. There was no shift bell to listen for. There was no way to police 1,000 individual sweeps doing their work in 1,000 individual houses between 4 and 7 in the morning. The laws failed because they assumed a model of enforcement that did not fit the structure of the trade. The factory model: central workplace, visible labour, countable workers, identifiable employer. The chimney sweep model: dispersed workplace, invisible labour, hidden workers, anonymous employer. And this is where Blackwell found the real mechanism. It was not cruelty. It was not ignorance. It was not even greed, though greed was certainly present. It was structural. The structure of the trade made it resistant to regulation. The invisibility of the labour, the dispersal of the employers, the silence of the victims, the complicity of the customers, the zero cost of the labour, the non-zero cost of the alternative. Every one of these factors individually could have been overcome. Together they formed a system, and the system was more durable than any single reform. Blackwell needs to talk about the children now, not as statistics, as people, because the parliamentary archives contain their names and someone should say them. There was a boy named James Cooper. He was 8 years old in 1839 when his master, a London sweep named George Ruff, sent him up a chimney in a house on Wimpole Street. The chimney was still warm. The soot had not been loosened. James became stuck at a bend roughly 30 feet above the fireplace. He called for help. His master told him to keep climbing. James could not keep climbing. His knees were wedged against the brickwork. His arms were pinned at his sides. He was stuck in darkness 30 feet above the ground in a passage 9 inches wide. It took 4 hours to extract him. The brickwork had to be broken open from the outside. By the time they reached him, James was barely conscious. His knees, elbows and shoulders were scraped to the bone. The skin of his kneecaps, which the climbing boys called their working skin, had been worn away entirely. George Rough was charged under the 1840 Act. The case reached a magistrate. Rough was fined 20 shillings, roughly £1, roughly the cost of a mechanical chimney brush. Rough was back at work the following week. James Cooper is not mentioned in any subsequent record. Blackwell does not know what happened to him. There was a boy known in the records only as the Hanley boy. No first name survives. In 1847, in Staffordshire, he was sent up a chimney in a pottery works. The chimney was a horizontal flue, which meant the boy had to crawl rather than climb. Horizontal flues were the most dangerous because gravity worked against the child. If he lost consciousness, he could not fall downward to safety. He would simply remain in place, face down in the soot. The Hanley boy did not come out. His master sent a second boy in after him. The second boy found the first boy's body. He had suffocated. The soot had filled his mouth and nose. The coroner's report noted that the boy's cap, which was supposed to protect his face, had been pulled off during the crawl and was found several feet behind his body. No prosecution was brought. The inquest returned a verdict of accidental death. There was a girl. This surprises most people. Climbing boys were not exclusively boys. In rare cases, girls were used, particularly very young girls whose bodies were even smaller than boys of the same age. Blackwell found a reference in the 1817 parliamentary testimony to a girl of 6 who had been employed by a sweep in Nottingham. Her name was not recorded. Her injuries were burns to the hands and feet, chronic respiratory illness, and what the examining physician described as a pronounced curvature of the spine, consistent with repeated compression in confined spaces. She was 6. The mechanical brush sat on the shelf. Now Blackwell is going to tell you about the boy who ended it. His name was George Brewster. He was 12 years old. On February 13, 1875, in the city of Cambridge, a master sweep named William Wire sent George up a chimney at the Fulbourn Asylum, a facility for the mentally ill on the outskirts of the city. The chimney at Fulbourn was long and narrow, with multiple bends. George climbed. At some point, he became stuck. Wire, following the standard practice, lit straw beneath the boy to force him upward. The smoke and heat were intended to make the boy struggle, and the struggling was intended to free him. George did not come free. The smoke filled the flue. George Brewster suffocated. His body remained in the chimney for some time before it was extracted. The difference between George Brewster and the hundreds of boys who died before him was not the manner of his death. It was the location. Fulbourn Asylum was an institution. Institutions had administrators. Administrators kept records. Records attracted attention. The inquest into George Brewster's death was covered by local newspapers. The coverage was picked up by national papers. The Times ran the story. The public response was furious. Not because the public did not know. They knew. They had known for a century. Jonas Hanway had told them in the 1770s. David Porter had told them in the 1790s. Joseph Glass had shown them the alternative in 1803. Henry Grey Bennett had presented the evidence to Parliament in 1817. The Children's Employment Commission had documented the ongoing practice in 1863. They knew, but George Brewster died in a public institution, and public institutions had public accountability, and public accountability had newspaper coverage, and newspaper coverage had political consequences. The sequence that led from George Brewster's body in a chimney to the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 was not a sequence of moral awakening. It was a sequence of political exposure. Lord Shaftesbury, The reformer who had spent decades fighting for chimney sweep legislation introduced the bill within weeks of Brewster's death. This time, the opposition was muted. The newspapers had made opposition politically costly. The arithmetic had shifted. The cost of inaction was now higher than the cost of a brush. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 required that all chimney sweeps be licensed. It gave police the authority to enforce the ban on climbing boys. It imposed meaningful penalties, and critically, it created a mechanism for enforcement that fit the structure of the trade. The licensing system meant that sweeps could be tracked, identified, and held accountable. The practice stopped. Not immediately, not everywhere. But within a few years, the climbing boys were gone. The mechanical brush replaced them. The technology that had existed since 1803 finally became standard. 72 years. Blackwell wants to make sure the timeline is clear, because the timeline is the argument. 1775. Percival Pott identifies chimney sweeps cancer. The medical case against climbing boys is established. 1788. First Chimney Sweepers Act. Minimum age set at 8. No enforcement mechanism. Ignored. 1803. Joseph Glass invents the mechanical brush. The technological alternative exists. 1804. Society for Superseding the Necessity of Climbing Boys founded. Organized advocacy begins. 1817. Henry Grey Bennett's bill passes the Commons, dies in the Lords. First serious legislative attempt fails. 1834. New Chimney Sweepers Act. Minimum age raised to 14. Penalties increased. 4 prosecutions in 6 years. 1840. Act prohibits anyone under 21 from climbing. Practice continues. 1863. Children's Employment Commission documents ongoing use of climbing boys. Parliament receives report. Parliament does nothing. 1875. George Brewster dies. Public outrage. Shaftesbury's Bill. Licensing. Enforcement. The practice ends. 100 years from medical diagnosis to effective legislation. 72 years from technological solution to adoption. 58 years from the first organized reform effort to success. 41 years from the first bill to reach Parliament to a bill that actually worked. At every point in that timeline, the knowledge was sufficient. The technology was available. The moral case was established. The political will was expressed. And at every point, the system continued because the cost of a child was 0 and the cost of change was not. Blackwell wants to talk about the number 0 for a moment, because 0 is not just a number in this story, it is the mechanism. When a parish workhouse supplied a climbing boy to a master sweep, the transaction was not just free, it was negative cost. The parish paid the sweep. The child was a liability on the parish books, an orphan consuming resources, producing nothing, occupying space. Every child apprenticed to a sweep was a child removed from the rolls. The parish saved money. The ratepayers saved money. The vestry clerk signed the indenture, the sweep walked out with a boy, and every party to the transaction was better off. Except the boy. This negative cost is what made the system so resilient. It was not merely that children were cheap. It was that the entire system of supply, from workhouse to sweep to chimney, was self-reinforcing. Every actor in the chain had a financial incentive to continue. The parish saved money by apprenticing children. The sweep gained free labor. The homeowner got cheap chimney cleaning. The system fed itself. The mechanical brush could not compete with 0. It could not compete with negative cost. It could not compete with a system where every participant profited from the status quo and no participant bore the cost of change. The only thing that could break the system was making the cost of inaction visible, and the cost of inaction was measured in dead children. but dead children in chimneys were invisible. That was the design. The chimney was dark. The work happened before dawn. The body was extracted quietly. The coroner's inquest was local. The parish buried the boy in an unmarked grave. The master sweep continued working. George Brewster was the boy who died in the wrong place. A public institution, a place with records, a place where a death could not be made to disappear. His death was not worse than the deaths of James Cooper or the Hanley boy or the 6-year-old girl from Nottingham. His death was not more tragic. It was more visible, and visibility was the only currency the system could not discount to zero. Blackwell needs to sit with that for a moment. The mechanism that finally ended 72 years of killing children was not conscience. It was not legislation. It was not technology. It was embarrassment. Public, newspaper-driven, politically costly embarrassment. The system did not stop because it became wrong. It stopped because it became seen. And here is where Blackwell turns the lens. Because this story is not about the Victorian era. The Victorian era is the case study. The mechanism is the subject. And the mechanism is not historical, it is structural. It is alive. It is operating right now, in systems you participate in, with costs you do not see, producing outcomes you would not accept if they were visible. The mechanism has 5 components. Blackwell identified them in the chimney sweep case, and Blackwell has seen them in every comparable delay between known solution and actual adoption. Component 1. Zero-cost labor. When the human cost of a system is borne by people with no economic value in the eyes of the system has no internal incentive to change. The climbing boys were orphans, parish wards, the children of the destitute. Their economic value was zero. Their suffering did not register as a cost in any ledger that mattered to any decision-maker with the power to act. Component 2. Dispersed responsibility. No single person was responsible for a climbing boy's death. The parish signed the indenture. The sweep sent him up the chimney. The homeowner hired the sweep. The magistrate declined to prosecute. The Member of Parliament voted against the bill. The Lord in the upper chamber killed the legislation. Each actor could point to another actor. Each actor bore a fraction of the responsibility, so small that it rounded to zero. Component 3. Invisible labor. The work happened inside a chimney, before dawn, behind closed doors. The injuries accumulated slowly. The cancer appeared years later. The deaths were quiet. There was no factory floor for an inspector to visit. There was no shift bell for a journalist to hear. The suffering was architecturally hidden. Component 4. Organized resistance at the point of profit. The master sweeps lobbied. They testified. They organized. They were not powerful men, but they were proximate to powerful men. They cleaned the chimneys of Parliament. They were part of the infrastructure of the ruling class. And they resisted change with the focused intensity of men whose livelihood depended on the status quo. Component 5. The enforcement gap. Laws were passed. Laws were not enforced. The structure of the trade made enforcement nearly impossible, and each unenforced law created a more dangerous illusion than no law at all. The illusion that the problem had been solved. The 1788 Act, the 1834 Act, the 1840 Act. Each one allowed Parliament to declare victory and move on. Each one allowed the public to believe the children were protected. Each one was a lie written in legislative language. 5 components: zero-cost labor, dispersed responsibility, invisible labor, organized resistance, the enforcement gap. Together, they form a system that is more durable than any single reform, any single law, any single technology. The mechanical brush could not defeat this system. The brush addressed one component, the technology. It provided an alternative to climbing boys, but it did not address the other four. It did not make children economically valuable. It did not consolidate responsibility. It did not make the labor visible. It did not neutralize the organized resistance. It did not close the enforcement gap. Only George Brewster's death in a public institution covered by newspapers, creating political consequences for identifiable politicians, addressed all five simultaneously. The visibility shattered the invisibility. The newspaper coverage concentrated the dispersed responsibility onto specific officials. The political consequences neutralized the organized resistance. The licensing system closed the enforcement gap. And the public outrage finally made the cost of a child something other than zero. It took a dead boy in the right chimney to do what 72 years of technology, legislation, and moral argument could not. Blackwell wants you to think about that, not as history, as a diagnostic tool. Look at the systems around you. Look for the five components. Where is the labor invisible? Where is the responsibility dispersed? Where is the resistance organized? Where is the enforcement absent? And most importantly, where is the human cost priced at zero? Because somewhere, right now, the brush is on the shelf. The solution exists. The knowledge is sufficient. The moral case is established. And the children are still climbing. Blackwell found one more thing in the archives. It is a small thing, but Blackwell has not been able to stop thinking about it. In the records of the Society for Superseding the Necessity of Climbing Boys, there is a list of subscribers. People who donated money to promote the mechanical brush. The list includes names, addresses, and amounts. Blackwell read through 3 years of subscription records, from 1804 to 1807. Many of the subscribers were the same people who employed master sweeps using climbing boys. They donated to the cause of abolishing the practice. Then they went home and hired a sweep who sent a child up their chimney. They knew. They cared enough to write a check. They did not care enough to change their own behavior. This is not hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is too simple a word. This is the mechanism operating at the individual level. The donation addressed the conscience. The hiring addressed the convenience. Both were rational within the system. Both made sense to the person writing the check. And between the donation and the hiring, a boy climbed into a chimney. Blackwell has thought about this for a long time, about the distance between knowing and doing, about the gap between the check and the chimney, about how a person can hold both truths simultaneously, the truth that children should not climb chimneys, and the truth that this particular chimney needs to be cleaned by Tuesday, and not experience those truths as contradictory. The mechanical brush is still in the Bristol Museum. Blackwell has seen it. It is a simple device. Cane rods, bristle heads, a ball joint for navigating bends. It is elegant in its simplicity. It is functional. It is old. It has been in the museum for a very long time. It was never the brush that was missing. If you think 72 years is a long time to ignore a solution, Blackwell has another story for you. 1 dam, 2 floods, 100 years apart. The same mistake made by the same people in the same valley. But that is next time. The brush is still in the museum. So is the lesson.